This week's episode of the podcast was recorded on the 2nd of March 2022 at home in Wicklow. And it starts with an angry cowboy and moves on to an angry dictator with whom you could well be familiar. I have a look at what's unfolding in Ukraine. I look at Putin and the cult of personality and the agenda of dictators. I look at how people are responding to that conflict. I also talk about, I don't use the term, but I talk about compassion fatigue. I look at how people jump onto hot topics nowadays and play out a very intense devotion to said topic for a brief spell and then move on to the next thing. And I express concern that that might be what unfolds with regard to sympathy for Ukraine. Moldovan painters feature in this episode and their contribution to the geopolitical discussion, or to my geopolitical understanding. To return to that angry cowboy, I do talk a little at the start about some cowboy movies, and I mess up. I refer to the actor Michael Gambon as James Gambon for some reason. I was confusing him with another actor. But Michael Gambon is who I was talking about, so forgive that slip when it comes. I look at the word stakeholder and why I don't like it when it's not used in a strictly business sense. And I discuss business language and how it's infiltrated sort of public discourse, and how I don't trust it and don't like it and how it's dehumanizing. And I finished today's episode with just a little bit of advice for managing our sort of news related anxiety. And I just offer a little bit of counsel in that area in terms of just being careful about how much we consume, how much information we consume, and just to be wary of the negative effects of that, and to make sure we're minding ourselves while consuming all that content that's out there. So that's what's coming up today. I hope you enjoy what you hear, and I'll see you there right around the corner. Cheers.
Not gonna change my mind. Living the dream.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. How are you? How are you on this manky, mouldy day? At the time of recording, that is. I'm looking out the window and the rain it's coming down. It's not letting up. It's very much here. It's a mouldy day. Imagine if that had been Bill Withers's song. Just wanna look at you. And I know it's gonna be a mouldy day, mouldy day, mouldy day. That wouldn't have been very nice. But you know what? There's truth in that. Some people come along and you see them and you go, oh Jesus, this is going to be a mouldy day. Mouldy for those of you not from this particular saturated island is a simple mispronunciation of mouldy. And I'm sure you can guess what it means. Yeah, not good. Anyway, what can you do? C'est la vie. It's March. Happy March. Happy March, everyone. Happy March. March does truly feel like the spring month, even though spring sprang last month, apparently. February was mild. It was mild. But what we're seeing now is a proliferation of young daffodils. Every road I drive down, daffodils. And at my parents' house the other day, a lovely array of crocuses and a scattering of snowdrops. It's kind of already really beyond snowdrop time. I do love an old snowdrop. The old Plorine Schnockta. I like a snowdrop. Lovely, lovely. Is Plorine tear? Is that what that is? Is it tear? Does it translate as tear? So it's like snow tear? That's rather lovely, isn't it? That's rather beautiful. Good old Irish. Good old Gaeilge. Anyway, here we are. Another day, another week, another episode of the podcast. And today, I'm not sure what direction I'm driving. I have a few little notions puttering around the golf course of my brain, and I'm just going to see. I'm going to see what comes up. A few topical issues, perhaps, but I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Sam Elliott. Do you know who I'm talking about? Sam Elliott. That tall, mustachioed American actor with the gravelly voice. He sort of talks like this. Sam Elliott has played many cowboys, amongst other things, in his lengthy career. Sam Elliott is in his late 70s now, 77 or 78. You might remember him from The Big Lebowski, the cowboy who's sitting at the bar in the bowling alley and he sort of narrates the tale. You might also know him from... What else? You might know him from... was he in The Contender as the advisor to Jeff Bridges' Jeff Bridges' president? I think his name was Kermit in that. And it was a rare appearance of Sam Elliott without his moustache. He has a very distinctive moustache. Many years ago, he was in Mask with Cher and Eric Stoltz, directed by Peter Bogdanovich. That was really the one that probably put him on the map in a significant way. And in more recent years, he was Bradley Cooper's older brother in A Star Is Born. And they had one of those great emotional men moments where towards the end of the movie, Bradley Cooper confesses to him that it was him. It was his older brother he's been idolising his whole life. And they've been having a fractious time, and as Sam Elliott turns away from him to reverse out of the drive, his eyes are full of tears. Powerful moment. It's a very effective one. Just like I was referring to Donald Sutherland's performance recently in Ordinary People, and that's one of the final moments of that movie where Timothy Hutton, playing his son who's been dealing with all sorts of tough stuff, turns to him and says, "I love you, Dad." And Donald Sutherland just whips his head around and looks at him with tears in his eyes. Nice. Men finding it hard to express those feelings. All we want is a little bit of love. We just want to know. We want to know you care. And we're too proud. I speak for all men. I speak for myself. Anyway, Sam Elliott, just a great presence, really. This kind of laconic, cool-headed presence, who has just cut a nice, quiet path through American movies over 40 years, really. Anyway, listen, I was listening to him being interviewed on the Mark Maron podcast just the other day, and fine, very typical Mark Maron podcast. He always goes back, tries to get the backstory. Where did it all start? What did your parents do? How did you get into acting or whatever it is? He does interviews largely actors and comedians. And he's just got a good touch, Mark Maron. He's very much, he lives in that kind of emotional, psychological landscape, and he's passionate about kind of movies and books, and he just connects. He connects very well with artists and creative people. But the interview was, all of that sort of stuff, the backstory, the history, the early breaks, negotiating the career, relationships, and then towards the end of the podcast, Mark Maron very casually asked him if he liked The Power of the Dog. The Power of the Dog, which I was raving about a couple of episodes ago. And my God, like Sam Elliott, who's so laid back, a man of very few words. Why use 2 words when one will do very nicely, thank you? And he just lit up. He was like, oh my God. I mean, you should go and seek it out and listen to it. I mean, it's a nice interview anyway, but even if you just skip to, 10 minutes or so before the end, you'll catch his response to Power of the Dog. He hated it. He was infuriated and enraged by it. And, he got into this kind of, not marvellous kind of rhetoric, kind of talking about Jane Campion and kind of going, where does this woman get off, coming from wherever she comes from, and filming there and pretending it's Montana, and whatever, he can like or dislike the movie, but what really got his blood boiling was, I think it was an ad, if I heard it correctly, it was like a promo piece in the New York Times, where the quote was about Power of the Dog. The quote was, the evisceration of the American myth, or an evisceration of the American myth. And this just, Sam Elliott, it was more than he could bear. And he was just scathing about the homoerotic subtext and the homoerotic kind of motifs throughout the story. And he was just so disgusted. Now, I don't necessarily think Sam Elliott is either, chauvinistic or sexist or dismissive of Jane Campion. He did say he loved all her other work up until then. I don't think he's necessarily homophobic. I think what really got to him was this idea that the American myth, by which I think the suggestion was the notion of American sort of toughness and maybe a particular brand of American masculinity as delineated in cowboy stories and cowboy movies and the Wild West, and forging those paths and winning those wars and settling the land and doing it tough. And I think my feeling was, and Sam Elliott didn't exactly articulate it because he was just too busy being furious, and the 3 words that he kept saying were, what the fuck? He was so pissed off. It was very entertaining and very real, very honest reaction. And it was clear that he felt, hold on a second, these were real experiences. And yeah, I guess he was kind of under, why, there's no myth to eviscerate there. I mean, I suppose the original, in recent memory, the Western, the revisionist Western that, destroyed the myths of alpha gunfighters, alpha gunslingers, alpha cowboys taking care of business was Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, where the sort of frailty of these men and the sort of deconstruction of courage and success in the heat of battle, Clint Eastwood just ripped that to shreds and did so in what I think is still an excellent movie, and which gave us some really great performances. Those sort of 4 main, maybe 5 actually, the 5 kind of main male performances in that movie. Clint Eastwood himself, of course, Morgan Freeman as his pal, and then Richard Harris, Gene Hackman. So they were the old guard, and then there was a young actor. Was it James? What was his name? James. Oh, I've gone blank on his surname. He was the young pretender, the young kid who was talking a good fight, but ultimately didn't have it. I want to say it's James, it's James with a Z at the end, and then the surname is James there's a W, I think, that starts it. Anyway, you can go and look it up. But in any case, I loved The Power of the Dog, and it in no way detracts from a lot of very straightforward, straight down the line westerns that I have enjoyed over the years. Again, if you're looking for another take on the western, something a little bit gentler, a little bit more thoughtful. You could do worse than check out Open Range, which I want to say Kevin Costner directed. Maybe he didn't. He definitely acted in it. That's probably 10 or 15 years old now. Open Range with Kevin Costner and Robert Duvall, as they're just sort of are they freeholders, and they come up against a very angry rancher played by James Gambon, who was born in Dublin a long time ago. There you go. But that's a rather nice Western as well. There's been a few of these kind of more reflective mid-tempo Westerns over the last 20 years. Appaloosa was another good one with Ed Harris and Viggo Mortensen. Quite liked that. Anyway, I didn't mean to get stuck on the Western track. I love all that stuff. I love the iconography of the American West and those stories. I like the clothes. I like the hats. I like the guns. I like the characters. And I like the that evolution and that reckoning of I suppose ultimately they're sort of colonization stories in a way, and pioneer stories, and negotiating the terrain, negotiating the indigenous Americans. That's really the sort of the shadow story to all of those Westerns. The sort of the whitewashing and the very one-dimensional approach to Native Americans, because that didn't fit the narrative. Probably if you go to John Ford's Searchers, it explores that suspicion and racism and hatred as embodied by John Wayne as he sets out on that mission to find the girl who's been taken by the Indians, very uncompromising terms. But that is often heralded as being right up there with the very best of them, the very best of Western tales. But maybe if you're a Native American, you have a very different take on that. If you looked at Wind River by Taylor Sheridan from about 7 or 8 years ago, the brilliant Jeremy Renner performance, and Gil Birmingham in that as well, that is really a modern Western and takes place on a reservation and looks at the sort of deprivation and the disenfranchisement of Native Americans today, and it's set against the plot of a sort of a thriller, really, and a murder mystery, a sort of a procedural, police procedural, but really, really good. Quite tough and grim, as is the way with Taylor Sheridan, who, as it happens, just to bring this full circle, that's what Sam Elliott was promoting on the podcast, on Mark Maron's show. He's talking about a new Western series that he's doing called 1883, about one of those great treks out west, and it's a prequel to the series Yellowstone, starring Kevin Costner, which I have not watched, but it sounds pretty good. Anyway, there you go. Who doesn't like The Power of the Dog? Sam Elliott. That's who. But I still really like that guy. And speaking of things we like and don't like, and things other people don't like, who doesn't like Ukraine? I'll give you a clue. His first name begins with V. His second name begins with P. And he likes to ride horses with his clothes off. Well, with his top off. Speaking of which, that's another thing Sam Elliott was giving out about. he was giving out about all the topless cowboys just striding around in their chaps. It sounds like something out of YMCA, Village People territory. But there you go. Vladimir Putin. We've all seen the photo. Vlad, bare-chested, sitting astride his steed, impressing us with his virile masculinity. Oh, I can smell it. I can smell it from here. Now, I don't know. Should I be treating this lightly? I'm not treating it lightly. The invasion of Ukraine it's just a horror show, and it feels wrong on so many levels. And the end game, it's hard to see what it is or where it's going to go. My superficial reading, I make no pretense to have any real grasp of the complexities of the geopolitical situation or the geopolitical implications. But it has seemed to me for some time that Putin is a very, very canny operator who delights in disrupting Western composure, and who is, again, one of these strong men leaders who tolerates no opposition and who seems to bear a serious grudge that probably goes all the way back to kind of Cold War times. He bears a serious grudge against the West and against the US particularly. It would seem against NATO. He feels that Russia has been hard done by, and he wants Russia to remain a very potent force in that part of the world. And this is a way of asserting his authority and basically sticking his fingers up to the West and to NATO in particular, to basically go into Ukraine under the pretense of protecting these states at the eastern side of Ukraine, which, according to Putin, are full of people who identify as Russian, and they need to be recognized as independent states. Now, I heard yesterday, and this is where maybe Western media lets us down again and again and again. I heard yesterday from a friend of mine who's just employed a crew of Moldovan painters that the Moldovan contractor, informed my friend that Ukraine has been very antagonistic towards those regions in the eastern part of the country and has been bombing them. And that was the first I'd heard of that. Now, you might go, you dirty looking Egypt. I mean, we all knew that. I didn't. And that certainly hasn't come up in any of the articles that I've been reading, any of the content that I've been reading regarding this invasion of Ukraine. So, as ever, the West, the media, the mainstream media, just oversimplifies the situation. And what we're seeing is, and don't get me wrong, again, and unfortunately, this is indicative. This is absolutely indicative of the nature of how so many people engage with issues in the world these days. It's very, very quickly jumping on a bandwagon, very quickly taking a position, nailing colours to the mast, and it just becomes so one-dimensional and so resistant to nuance, so resistant to a complex matrix being applied, which is not, and please don't misunderstand me, that's not a way to usher in equivocation or to remove an emotional response or an ethically or morally informed response, but it's to look at these situations, whatever they might be, and try to really engage with all truths, rather than just latching on to one convenient, easily digestible truth. So while I in no way support or endorse, and this will be a big loss. This will be a big loss to Putin's PR campaign when he finds out that the Clear Out podcast doesn't endorse his invasion of Ukraine. I know that's going to give him pause for thought. So Vlad, in advance, I'm sorry, I can't go with you on this one. I in no way endorse the invasion and bombing of the Ukraine and of Ukrainian cities. My feeling is it's a terrible misjudgment by Putin. I think he's really overstepped. I think the response internationally seems to be almost entirely in support of the Ukrainian position, and it seems to be largely condemnatory of Putin's actions. I think he hasn't read the situation. I think, again, from what I've consumed, it seems he was expecting Ukraine to just roll over and take their punishment. But clearly the president, Zelensky, has been a very savvy and canny operator himself, the way he's conducting his interactions with the media and with the public via his phone, and recording videos and being defiant and forthright and standing up there and saying, no, we're actually not having this, we're not going anywhere. We're going to resist the oppressor. Now, when I say he's canny and savvy, I think Zelensky understands that there's a moment here, and that there's an opportunity to leverage this situation to Ukraine's advantage. And I don't know. I mean, why wouldn't he, I suppose? I think from a geopolitical point of view, and again, I am not a student of this stuff, so this is more, from a couple of conversations with friends who know more than me, including my cousin here at #blessed, who has studied this stuff. I think what's really in the best interests of the world is balance. When we're talking about countries with power, when we're talking about countries with nuclear capability, when we're talking about alliances and treaties and ideologies and economic and political power and economic and political will, I think balance is best. So, I mean, is this the real lesson to be learned, or is this can we stand back and contemplate the idea that it wouldn't be good for a single organization to have an excess of global influence, and by organization I mean an organization like NATO. Like, if NATO just expanded and expanded and expanded until everything's NATO, is that good or bad? Does it become too powerful? Does it wield too much influence? I mean, in a way, isn't it good to have a certain amount of opposition to keep things in check? That's where the balance comes in. It can't all be just on one side of the ledger, surely. And again, maybe I'm just being completely naive in how I'm thinking about these things. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, I've heard a few people suggest that perhaps from within Russia or within Putin's government, that he'll push concerned parties to take action against him and to disempower him. I'm not sure what that would look like in terms of Russian politics, if that would have to be a coup of some kind. I can't see Putin ever going peacefully. I also read something about his personal wealth being the thing he values more than anything, even though a lot of his rhetoric is dressed up in in a sort of, jingoistic, pro-Russian culture, pro-Russian identity, this assertion of Russian identity and a commitment to preserving Russian sovereignty, Russian identity, Russian safety, Russian influence, that Russia is not going to be this, beaten child, neglected or ignored by the West, disregarded. There is certainly something about, take us seriously, take Russia seriously. There was something else I read that was quite interesting in relation to Putin conceding that the Soviet Union, in relation to the Soviet Union being broken up, if we go back to whatever it was, 89, that of course was necessary, but I think the line is that to not value the Soviet Union, is insane. To not wish for an entity as powerful as the Soviet Union is insane. But to actually wish for the restoration of the Soviet Union is equally insane. So he wants that sort of power and influence and regard and status internationally, whereas he seems to concede that the breakup and the ever increasing independence of the former Soviet states is an inevitability, and yet obviously he feels that the only way to assure that the status of Russia remains where he wants it is this act of aggression against Ukraine, which is, I think, fundamentally, it's a two-tiered attack. It's obviously primarily, the Ukraine is the primary target, and it's like, get in line, behave yourself. But it's also a message to NATO to behave itself and go, you don't need to encroach any further towards the Russian border. Anyway, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I had another friend who's also well-versed in geopolitics, and, he was wondering about how, people get caught up in the personalities of these leaders, these strongmen leaders, and he was kind of going, we should be focusing on states, and what states want, and the desire of the state. But I was questioning that. I think so much seems to be caught up in the ego of the individual. And when you've got an autocrat / dictator like Putin, my argument is that, as a bad actor, so to speak, once again, not referring to myself and my miserable acting career, but someone not acting in good faith, that they dictate the culture. So if one argument is he is a product of the culture and a product of the will of the people, I mean, that's a democratic model. But my argument is when you get an autocrat or a dictator, benign or otherwise, and the history of the world would show us that there's enormous influence by the gargantuan personality, and the cult of personality is part of the trappings of state. Iconography and propaganda and censorship and controlling the message. And again, you think of, those images, they're probably going back 10 years, the images of Putin, man of action, out in the wilderness, firing guns, and I don't know, what else was he doing? Riding the horse. Maybe he was, playing with, doing a bit of falconry, that kind of thing as well. Archery, I don't know, wrestling grizzly bears. Who knows? But it's almost comically cliched. Let me show you what a man I am. It's, I I mean, yeah, would you not be a little bit embarrassed maybe? No? Like, where is your masculinity located? Let me show you my boobs. That's where it's located. Have you seen my... I mean, it's not even like he has a particularly impressive body. Oh, good luck. Yeah, that's... yeah, there's some ego. But anyway, that's my argument, that the dictator, the toxic personality dictates. Well, a dictator dictates. Take this down. A dictator dictates the culture. It flows from them. I mean, it was only like a week before the invasion that Putin had a sort of a staged, public consultation with other members of, Russian government, where basically he was saying, this is my plan. Does anybody disagree? And, then looks around the room and like, who's going to contradict him? Because his enemies end up poisoned, dead, or, in penal servitude. Yeah, so there you go. Anyway, look, Ukraine, you just don't want that conflict to go on and on and on. I'm not sure what the solution will be. I don't know what will stop the guns or the tanks or the bombings. Certainly these sanctions that the West are imposing on Russia, there's no way in hell Putin hasn't considered all of that. So, St. Petersburg loses the Champions League final. I'm sure Putin's really upset. He knew. No one's going to play football with Russia. He knew. Do you think he cares? Not a bit of it. I think the main problem is Ukraine are not rolling over and just taking it. So it'll be interesting to see. There's also been huge displays of solidarity and support for and with Ukraine in the last week. And it just remains to be seen how long that will last and what that will mean in real terms, in terms of real support, in terms of trying to bring the conflict to an end, as opposed to people just, as I said before, a certain amount of jumping on the bandwagon, a certain amount of virtue signalling, I suppose, to be very cynical about it. A certain amount of, this is topical, let me jump on this issue right now and show that I care. It's always about the long fight, in my opinion. It's always about, what are people going to be doing in 2 weeks? Because the thing is, people get bored and people get jaded and people get sick of the bad story. I remember seeing this laid out in a comic when I was a kid. This isn't the first time I've referred to this comic. So, the legendary 2000 AD, the British sci-fi comic, which always had this dystopian thread running through every single one of its strips, every single one of its stories. Always something very cynical, very dystopian. It always seemed to find the worst in humanity, but brilliantly told stories and brilliantly etched anti-heroes and heroes, and full of full of the work of brilliant artists. And it was actually my older brother who brought it into our household. But so when I was finished with the Beano or the Dandy, which was more my pitch, I gradually got into 2000 AD and characters like Judge Dredd and Rogue Trooper and Halo Jones. And one of my favourites was a character called Johnny Alpha from the strip called Strontium Dog. And that was basically the strip centered around these bounty hunters who were mutants and very much vilified and unloved by the general populace, and they did the dirty work of bounty hunting. And Johnny Alpha, he was the central character, and who we were asked to identify with, and his His sidekick was a giant Viking called Wolf Sternhammer. But Johnny Alpha, in one of the stories, Johnny Alpha is basically what happens is there's a guy who takes over the running of the Strontium Dogs, the bounty hunters, that organization, and we find out over time that this new chief hates mutants, and so under false pretext, he captures Johnny Alpha and is interrogating him. I can't remember what he was trying to find out, but basically viciously torturing him to get what he wants. And the comic strip depicted this brilliantly, in that in the initial days of his interrogation, the mutants were really concerned about their fellow bounty hunter, and genuinely worried, genuinely troubled by what was happening to him. But over the course of a couple of weeks, which is a few panels in the comic strip, gradually they just got sick of hearing him cry out, till eventually the concluding strip was like, "Shut up, Alpha, we're sick of listening to you." And I remember the kind of the cynicism and the kind of the coldness and the callousness the callousness of that, and the journey from total empathy to total disregard really stayed with me. I was like, oh, that's not a very nice feeling, because I was still very worried about Johnny Alpha and him being interrogated and tortured. Spoiler alert, in the end, he got out and exposed the chief for being the mutant hater that he was, and he got his just desserts, because Johnny Alpha always got his man. Anyway, there you go. So I'm offering that as an analogy. So if at the moment, and this is very justifiable, of course, and there's a lot of concern, and I share those concerns for the people of Ukraine. So many innocent people, so many civilians being punished by Putin's agenda, his ego, and his military machine. Let's hope we are still as concerned in the months to come. One of my uncles pointed out on Facebook that this is good and it's right and well done. And what about Palestine? Because they've been occupied for 76 years. So again, it's just to sort of go, okay, is this just the pet topic of the moment? So what does conviction really mean? What does conviction look like? And let me just jump in and say, it's not where I live. I don't live in political activism. That's not my bag. This is where I live. This kind of stuff. This is the extent of my outspokenness and advocacy. Other than sitting down with a friend over a cup of coffee or whatever, I'll just try to work from my corner over here in the way that I do. And it's, as you know, if you've been listening, it's much more about the intimate. It's much more about the personal. It's much more about that journey. And I think if that journey goes well, the ripple effect is that everyone's journey gets better. So, okay. So now a little offshoot of this is that there was something interesting came out of China in response to the Ukraine invasion, and it was a public letter from 4 or 5 significant Chinese historians who were extremely critical of China not taking a clear position in terms of being critical of the Russian invasion. And the first thing that was striking to me about that was that it hadn't been censored, although I believe it eventually was censored within quite a short time of that letter being public and online. It was removed. But I also read that there's a long history of historians having that kind of voice in China. And I think they were trying to put it into a context of, of sort of the balance of power in the world and not being caught on the wrong side of history. But there was something else, and I'm not sure if it was that response, that particular response of theirs, or if it was something, maybe it was the official Chinese response, which was a bit more ambiguous and, a little bit sort of sitting on the fence. But the word that was used, and maybe this wasn't used by the historians, maybe this was in the official Chinese position, there was the word used was in relation to China's future, ongoing and future influence, ongoing and future status. The word used was China's commitment to being a stakeholder. And that word jumped out at me. And because I was thinking, business lingo and business speak, has, infiltrated, workplaces. It's very kind of dispassionate language, very, very dehumanizing language, very corporate language. And if by corporate we mean something, language that represents the interest of the corporation, not language that represents the interests of the people or the interests of the worker. And it's very, it's in George Orwell territory, in my opinion. It's language that is, it's designed to appear innocuous. It's designed to appear to be without significance or power. But I would argue that's where its power is. I think it's very, insidious and disingenuous and dishonest. And in no way is it, well, I shouldn't say in no, I was going to say in no way is it real. I mean, it's real insofar as it does serve the larger aim of the corporation, of the big money, of the agenda of the, again, I don't want to fall into bloody boring cliches. I was going to say the agenda of the 1%, them, those people. But the agenda of the people in power, the agenda of those who stand to gain the most. So they have the power already, and inevitably they're always looking to secure, to secure that power even more, or to expand that power, to give away less, as little as possible. And that word stakeholder has cropped up again and again in public discourse, and these words, they become kind of meaningless. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like in the past, you go back to, a stakeholder is someone who owns part of a company or part of a business. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong, listener. Isn't that right? Isn't a stakeholder someone who has bought shares in a company, bought shares in a business? They are a stakeholder. I have this percentage stake in this company. Therefore, I am interested. Therefore, I am invested. Therefore, I care about the success or failure of this company. Because if it succeeds, I get money. My investment pays back. And then I'm in a position to increase my stake. So there you go. There's my my business 101 model. I hope that was an accurate explanation of stakeholder. So when did stakeholder get shifted into this area of human interaction? I mean, I myself, I succumbed to the pressure of using the term. I used it in an article I wrote on the website a few months ago. I was talking. What was I talking about? I was sort of touching on identity politics. I was touching on the discourse that has attended to identity politics and the culture wars. And I think the piece I wrote was largely about focusing on what's important for the individual, not getting caught up in the rhetoric of culture wars, identity wars, but bringing it back to basics, and that being a positive thing where you focus on what's really essential. And if we all dropped back to that level rather than the endless assertion of our identity, our personal agenda, our personal sense of injustice, but to just focus on the necessities of survival and staying well, and that we extend like a positive disregard to other people, that would be a good thing. And that, one of the arguments, and I'm going to read you the section in a second. One of my arguments was when the different sort of groups stand up and go, what about us? My argument is that all that does is make it easier for those in power to identify you and disenfranchise you further, ring fence you. Here's how I expressed it in the article that I wrote. The article was called "Wishing Others Away." I'll add the link to the article in the podcast description. I said, but power and influence are key concepts here. We're all dealing in degrees of each. How much power do you have? And who do you influence with what you've got? And to what end? When your identity is siloed or ghettoized or ring-fenced, it is a dilution of your power and influence. It is a relegation, a sectioning away, a placing in a box. It is a demarcation that forbids participation in the main game, where the prize that is being competed for is to be taken seriously, to be given credibility without qualification, to have acknowledged by merely being on the pitch that you are a stakeholder. And that's what it all comes down to, isn't it? Being invited to the table, having a say, being a part of it. And conflict comes when the gates remain closed. And if a group is waving its banner and making a lot of noise, it's all the easier to identify and exclude, almost like a version of identity whack-a-mole. Anyway, I'll go on about other things. But you did hear there the word stakeholder. So, I suppose what we're talking about then is, if you're a stakeholder, the business or the company takes you seriously because you have a stake, because the company is beholden to you, because they have used your money to keep themselves afloat. They've used your money to expand. They've used your money to build the brand, to make themselves a better company or business. And therefore, as a stakeholder, you are not to be ignored. You are connected to it. So if we take that idea then into politics, I suppose. Politics, if we take it into international relations and go back to China describing itself, if not describing itself, being described by those historians, I can't remember which was which, but to say, we want to be a stakeholder. And I was thinking, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean then China, as is well documented, is a growing power in the world. Just like India is a growing power in the world. The US continues to have huge influence, but it's not, my understanding is the 20th century was regarded as America's century, as in the century of the United States. This century, it's not really going that way. The US as a political identity has probably been enormously devalued over the last several years. Probably this kind of devaluation or this kind of loss of credibility probably culminated in the Trump presidency and the messiness of the Trump presidency, the divisiveness of the Trump presidency. And again, if you want to draw that line back to Putin and what was his role or his administration's role in sowing the seeds of discontent, what was his administration's role in trying to facilitate Trump's rise, what was their role in the spread of misinformation, I'm not sure, but that's one to consider. So in any case, if China then is going to be a major power this century, and the idea then that a country would consider itself a stakeholder, I wonder then, and I don't know if this is being extremely paranoid or, as ever with me, maybe a touch simplistic, but do these powerful countries, do they view the world as their personal playpen, their box of toys to play with? Do they view the world as as a selection of tantalizing items, as a selection of items of varying value to them, and the world, they look at the world simply as a marketplace and nothing else. A marketplace, and when they have the buying power, it's simply a matter of how much and when. Or it's a matter of how do I decrease the value sufficiently, the apparent value, the monetary value of that item that I want, so I can buy it cheap, so I can flex my muscles then. And so I found myself wondering that, like, is that what we're to think? As a major stakeholder, I dictate what happens to this company. I dictate what happens to this entity. I think that's I don't know about you, but like, I find that thought detestable. And maybe that's really naive. Like, maybe it's naive to think that that's a new idea. I think probably if you go back through history, you'll find that there have always been enormously powerful entities, families primarily, perhaps royal lineages. Certain countries and empires have held sway at different times, and is that just the nature of human and nationalistic expansion? That when you have power, what are you going to do with it? If you have that much power, it's like it's the might is right path. Well, we can do what we want because at this moment in time we are the most powerful, so we're going to get all stuck up in your shit and do what we want. I mean, I suppose arguably you could say that's what the United States did for so much of the second half of the 20th century, or else the latter part of the 20th century. U.S. foreign policy was all about preserving its interests and pursuing its interests and doing what it could to quash anything, any entity, any country, any leader that threatened to get in the way of that. And that's another truism of Western media. The presentation of the West as being in the right. Very, very reductive and not really complex enough in how it looks at these things. Give us all the information. Give us all the information. Let us make up our own minds. Is that a scary thought? Let's go to that place. Okay, let's go to that place, the too much information place, because I think this is topical at the moment. If we've had 2 years of coronavirus related or coronavirus exacerbated anxiety, on top of all the other things we have good reason to be anxious about, there's definitely concern at the moment that this conflict between Ukraine and Russia is going to impact us all, if not directly, depending on where you live, that there's going to be, again, this spike in anxiety as the turbulence of the world, these ripples of instability, these tremors of fear, these tremors of destruction, of violence, threaten to kind of seep into our own lives and into our into our collective consciousness. So what can we do? What can we do to counter that? It's funny when my friend was telling me, this was just yesterday, my friend was telling me about the Moldovan painter. And the Moldovan painter sort of going, well, it's not as straightforward as you think. Sure, Russia's the bad guy going in like that, but Ukraine has been doing this to those regions, and there was a part of me, as my friend was relaying this information to me, there was a part of me that felt like, oh Jesus, I don't want to know. That was a part of my response. That was like, I just don't want to know. I just had this all kind of clear in my head. I felt I'd carried out my due diligence and consumed credible articles and opinion pieces about the background to the conflict, about Putin's motivations, about possible outcomes. I felt I had a reasonable grasp. And then my friend dropped that little bit of information on me via the Moldovan painting contractor. And I was like, oh, shit. And it was, on a certain level, it was stressful. On a certain level, it was unsettling, destabilizing, because I had to try and find a place to accommodate the new information. I had to find a way in to reconstruct what I thought I understood. And that brought with it an emotional response of what? Of frustration, of feeling unsettled, and I suppose you could say that there's a level of anxiety that came with that, of like, oh damn, I thought I had it settled and in a good place where I could grasp it. And I have spoken about this before. I have spoken about, and it's funny, my wife makes jokes about me not consuming, she makes jokes about me being very selective about the news that I consume. We had friends here the other day down to visit, an Irish guy and his Australian wife. So they're another version of us. And she made a joke. My wife made a joke about me having no interest in Australian politics, having barely any interest in Irish politics, and only consuming content on The Guardian. And as ever, there's always there's a grain of truth in these hilarious jokes. Oh, how I laughed! But it's not entirely true. It's partially true. But I spoke about this on an earlier episode of the podcast where I fundamentally was saying that there are benefits. There are benefits to remaining ignorant. Now, I'm not talking about sticking my head in the sand. I'm not talking about being in denial. I'm talking about accepting the limits of what you can know. I'm talking about accepting the limits in terms of time and energy and emotional space, in terms of how much can you consume, how much can you grasp. At the time, I think I was primarily referring to a lot of the discourse around COVID and how people were consuming ferocious quantities of information, a lot of contradictory information, a lot of information from various sources, and I was sort of just not going down that road. I was just taking on board the larger brush strokes. I was trusting much of the information I was being given in terms of being COVID restriction compliant, and rolling with the acceptance that the vaccine was probably going to be safe, and to conduct myself in a way that would reduce the chances of being exposed to COVID. And I was like, that's it. I've enough other things to be worrying about and to try and focus on. I'm not going to go down these rabbit holes of consuming all the information I can get, because why? Well, why would I want to do that? Am I trying to weaponize myself just so I can win some arguments with people who disagree with me? Am I trying to educate myself, like do a crash course in immunology or whatever division of science it might require me to become an expert in such things? I was like, I don't have the time, lads. I don't have the time. And similarly, coming back to Ukraine, Russia, I'm not suddenly an expert in geopolitics. You've heard the extent of my grasp of geopolitics in this podcast, and you can see that that's a very, very narrow it's a very narrow field. That extent, it's like a 2-inch square section of multiple hectares of land, if that land represented true understanding of geopolitics. Don't get me wrong, I always have interest in history. I have interest in politics. I am always interested in relationships. How do we relate to each other? How does Russia relate to Ukraine? How does Ukraine relate to the EU, to NATO? How does China relate to Russia? What are the implications for the countries where I've lived? What are the implications for Ireland? What are the implications for Australia? What are the implications for friends and family in France? All this kind of stuff. And this is the nature of, I think, for a lot of us, we just kind of go with what we know. Where are our pools, our spheres of interest, of influence, of experience? That's all we've got. How much can you know? So, to bring it back to the start of this section, go easy. Go easy with what you're consuming. Control the amount of information you're taking on. Control the amount of imagery and content from the conflict. Control how much of that you're exposing yourself to. Control, how many of those distressing images and individual stories you can take on. Try to, actually put a time limit on what you're going to read, what you're going to watch, what you're going to listen to, in terms of the things that could upset you, destabilize you, increase your anxiety. And again, it's not to say don't be informed. It's not to say pretend it's not happening. But for God's sake, you got to mind yourself within this. We are living in very turbulent times, very fractious times. Anxiety, is there an epidemic of anxiety? Is there an epidemic of poor sleep? Is there an epidemic of broken relationships? I don't know. There seems to be anecdotal evidence, because I haven't gone to the data. I haven't gone to the research. But I pick up snippets. Here and there on my travels. My travels on the World Wide Web, and anecdotally, and it does seem, there's a lot of stuff going on out there that is making us unwell, and you can get caught up in the tidal wave, the tsunami of what is it chaos, the tsunami of conflict, the tsunami of endless information, the tsunami of endless opinion, the tsunami of human angst and human crisis, and the crisis of humanity in every corner of the globe, like these multiple crises. I mean, in my wife's sort of hometown at the moment, there's terrible flooding, and the town has been like really devastated by the worst flooding in history. My sister-in-law's partner looks like he's lost his business. My parents-in-law have had the bottom of their house flooded and kind of destroyed. Lives have been lost. There's stuff going on everywhere, and just be careful. Just be careful with how much you're consuming. Ask yourself, what is it doing for you, consuming more than you need to of the bad news? Again, it's not to be indifferent, it's not to be uncaring, but you've really got to look at yourself and go, how does this actually affect me? Now, if you're good, genuinely, if you're all good and you're like, no, I can handle it, it's all good, and other parts of your life are not suffering as a result, and your own sense of wellness is not suffering as a result, off you go. Go your hardest, as they like to say in Australia. Do what you have to do. But I come back to my position. Just be careful how much of that stuff you're taking on. You got to regulate. You got to regulate yourself. Get back into the body. Get into some nice breathing. Get into a quiet moment. Put on some music that relaxes you. Close down the eyes. Get a comfortable seat. Breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, and deepen, soften, relax, calm yourself, and accept what's in your power to control, and accept what is not in your power to control, and just have a look at where your energy is going. Try and get your energy into a place that is self-nurturing. And then when that's taken care of, you're in much better shape to reach out to the people you care about in a way that is safe for you as well. And that's the goal. That's the goal, folks, to stay safe. And that's the goal. Let's extend that goal to the people of Ukraine. Let's extend a bit of that concern for the welfare of Russian people who don't want any part of this. I'm sure there's plenty of Russians, I know that much. I'm sure there's plenty of Russians who are like, oh man, really? I know my cousin here at #blessed, he's got a couple of Russian students, online Russian students, to whom he's been teaching English, and they've been working really hard to get out of Russia to seek some other education opportunities and work opportunities, and we're lining up their visas, and that's all gone out the window now because of this conflict. And these are very talented, capable young people, and their opportunities and their future has just been all put on hold, and who knows for how long. So, it all goes, it goes around. There's ripples. With conflict, there's always ripples. Look deep inside yourself. You know where conflict has touched you. Don't touch me, conflict. Don't touch me. I'm not in the mood. Okay? Just back the football off. Okay, there you go. I had no idea where I was going, but it started with Sam Elliott and it ended up with conflict. Sam Elliott, he didn't get a good cowboy hat for that show he's just filmed. For that show he's just finished filming. The cowboy hat didn't fit. He wasn't happy about that. This is a man in his 70s, It's like, come on, lads. Give him a hat that fits. A bit of respect, please. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. You can, as always, show me some love on social media. The Clear Out Podcast on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. The Clear Out 2, that's number 2. Digit 2, the Clear Out 2 on Twitter. You can email me at theclearoutlive@gmail.com if you wish to throw some feedback my way or have some suggestions for future topics. And you can support this show, this independent podcast that I love doing so much. You can support it using the supporter link in the description, wherever you're listening to this podcast. Or you can use the Patreon link, patreon.com/theclearout. I'd very much appreciate it. I'm going to start trying to put some exclusive content for Patreon users, Patreon supporters. So that's something to look forward to. And next week, I hope, if all goes well, I might have my first ever guest on the podcast. That's not including my wife and my cousin. We did that bit of music at Christmas for the Christmas episode, but this will be hopefully an interview for next week's episode with an old acting colleague of mine who's also a musician, and I think he's going to come on and talk about his latest musical project, and I hope we'll get to talk about wellness and other things as well. So that's hopefully going to be next week's show, if not next week, the week after. Okay, thanks again for listening. Take care of yourselves, stay out of trouble, stay calm, stay safe, bring that energy in. Be careful what you're consuming. All the best. Mind yourselves. Take care. Bye.